futures. And a primary objective of looking back to our economic futures is to vision or to study a post-occupied Aloha ʻāina political economy. And so we are applying some futures methods, and in futures, we don't really look, 5 years into the future, 10 years into the future. We're really looking 25 plus years into the future. So even though we're looking a generation plus ahead, still always we want to root our study and analysis in ancestral economic science. Another critical part of looking back to our economic futures is providing proposals or plans as to how we might get to this preferred post-occupied economy from the place that we're at today, which is in the disaster that is capitalism. And so here I'm primarily doing financial modeling. And so I'm using the methods that, the Warren Buffetts, the capitalists, the equities analysts, the hedge funds, those sort of tools that they're using. I want to make it open source to the Lahui. And I feel that this is important because capitalism really is a powerful system, and it's because it works in exponential patterns. And so I feel for us to effectively overcome the system, we too have to work at an exponential pace in some of our strategies. Okay, a little bit about my ohana. My father's Troy Kalevahea. He's in the photo on the left-hand side. Between he and I, we've lived in over 10 ahupua'a in our childhoods, including periods of houselessness. And I think in my research, it's really important to identify that the migratory patterns of our people is an important economic indicator, because this is representing economic insecurity and vulnerability. We have the crisis that is our diaspora, whether we're looking at the ʻaina, but also within the ʻaina. We know that the majority of us live in ahupua'a that are Kūpuna, we're not Hawaiian to. So I offer as sort of a litmus test that we know we're ready for successful economic transitions to our independence when the Hawaiian relationships are reestablished, and when this hyper sort of transience that my father and I and so many in our Lahui experience begins to lapse. So my father has a felony on his record. He has 11 siblings. Of the 12 of them, I want to say only 4 of them have not been victims to this racist system of mass incarceration by the United States. I have scores and scores of hoahana on this side of my ohana, and I want to say maybe 4 of us have college education, and probably only 3 of us are, in Aloha ʻāina consciousness, and which is the more important factor. But we know that this is because not, due to any fault of their own. It's because of this introduction of the domination ethic by the United States that has caused, people like my father's generation to grow up with severe abuse and trauma. I also want to shout out my hoahana Ku'le Alves. I know she's a part of your program. I'm not sure if she's on the call today, but she is a kūkaipuni. She is my ma'e. She's the leader of my generation. I thank her for the example that she provides to our generation and to our future Kalevahea descendants. I'm also the daughter of Jill Lauterbach on the right-hand side. She is the one who raised me. I actually met my father when I was 4 years old. I remember meeting him. I was super nervous. He's super rip and tick, but actually, yes, my mother is the one who raised me on her own. She's haole, but she also went through similar struggles as a keiki in deep poverty, a lot of severe abuse and neglect. She was put out of her home at the age of 13. Her highest level of education was 8th grade, still the most intelligent person I know. But same thing on that side of the ohana. Of my dozens and dozens of ohana, I think I'm the only one with college education. And so I come to you as a survivor with a lot of survivor's guilt. But what I would want you to know is that we need to use that guilt as a superpower. It's been a superpower in my life, a catalyst for change and accountability. Guilt is very different from shame. I don't advocate shame, but certainly guilt. And so I share all of this so you know more about me, but I share this because at the end of the day, I do this work for all of the Lahui, but I do this work especially for the economic least of these. I do this work and I provide plans that are going to take all of our people forward, not just the economic elite of our Lahui. I want us to recognize that even though we share a common oppressor, we don't all have the same levels of privilege. And so those of us with relatively more privilege, we need to be more accountable to the people that continue to suffer. And so for me, I'm cisgendered, I'm heterosexual. I'm questioning the heterosexuality, but for now I'm heterosexual. I have fair skin. Even though I grew up in poverty, I have relatively a higher income now compared to when I was a keiki. So I put it on myself to remember this and to remember the kanaka who come from where I come from, but they didn't land on the second sigma of the bell curve. They're still struggling today. And I know that you more than anyone know this as the kumu of our lahui. As my cousin Kutule would say, you're in the trenches day in and day out. You know what that suffering looks like and you stand beside our people. And I just, again, mahalo you tremendously for the work you do. Another aspect of my kuleana, I feel in informal and formal ways, I need to be like an older sister to what I hope will be the future Aloha ʻāina economists is what I'm calling them. Unfortunately, now in our lahui, we don't have many kanaka with a high degree of finance or economic skills who also have a very strong commitment to Aloha ʻāina consciousness. That's the people in the top right quadrant. Those are the unicorns. We do have some practitioners, but I would say in academia, we have none. Unfortunately, we have too many kanaka who do have these skills, but they use it for, nuclear ohana purposes. These are the assimilated kanaka in the top left quadrant. So I want to understand, what is the line between these two types of kanaka? How do we make sure we don't produce assimilated economists and instead we create unicorns? And so I'm sure you as teachers, you think of this sort of question and in varying ways. And so for me, I want to be an older sister. I also want to be a younger sister to those kanaka who are using capitalism for the benefit of our people, but because they are primarily practitioners, they're not thinking about the system as a whole. They don't have time to do that type of analysis. So they might think that they're capitalists, but I hope by providing scholarship, I can help them see that you can use capitalism as a transition tool that doesn't make you a capitalist. We just need to ensure that while we're wielding this powerful system, we also create an exit strategy, because ultimately this is a system that is meant to destroy us, which we'll get into. Let's skip a lot of this. So I actually gave this presentation earlier this week to an undergrad class. They were my first fully involuntary audience. I'm like, they're not going to remember half of the things I say. So I decided I wanted to highlight two primary takeaways that if you forget everything else, this is what I would want you to remember. And so the same thing for your haumana. The first thing is that labor is the source of all power in society. Whoever controls the labor controls the power. So we need to increase our analysis of labor, which increases our analysis of power, and therefore our ability to overcome the systems that destroy us. And so with young people, I want them to start with themselves. I want them to start getting a handle on their time and therefore their labor. And so this is a tool that I use to help me assess my labor capacity. These are all the skills that I feel that I need to adequately carry out my kuleana. On the very bottom row is the total of all the skills, and the gray shaded areas where I'm actually at today. So you can see I'm not even halfway where I need to be. But because of tools like this, being honest with myself about my labor capacity, it is a deep intrinsic motivator to help me be accountable to my kuleana. And so I told the students earlier this week, I work 75 hours a week. I work full-time as an auditor at a bank. I'm a graduate assistant. I'm a full-time student. So between those three things, I work 75 hours. That doesn't include the work that I'm doing right now, trying to produce and share research. At the business college, they don't give a damn about research. So there's no thesis program. This all has to be done independently. And if I wasn't being honest and having an analysis on my labor, I would not be able to adequately carry out what I'm supposed to do for our people and for our ʻāina. And so a first place to start in getting a handle on your time, what I told them is you need to prioritize your healing. And so I want to destigmatize mental health. And I've been trying to collect a little repository of Native Hawaiian mental health care providers. My number one recommendation is my therapist, Dr. Kpuna, in the top left corner. She is a PsyD, but rooted in our ancestral values. I think that all of us can benefit from therapy, whether or not you have mental illness. I've never been diagnosed with mental illness, but I show up and I do this work because why? It's helping me get a handle on my time, my labor, my power, and therefore, again, my ability to carry out my kuleana. The second thing I would want students to remember, if nothing else, is that when you are trying to analyze an economic system, it comes down to one fundamental question. And the question is this system based in science or is it not? And so for me, I subscribe to our ancestral economic theory, not because I'm Hawaiian, but because it is a system that is rooted in science. I am also part Italian, and they invented like modern accounting and modern finance and banking. I'm an accountant at a bank, and still, I'm sorry, I can't get down with that system, Kūpuna of Ikalia. And that is because at the end of the day, capitalism is a system that is predicated on infinite economic growth, also known as gross domestic product, on a finite planet. So this is a mathematically impossible system. And we're going to be looking at a few myths today because it's really important that we begin to undo the indoctrination of the hegemonic form of economics, neoclassical economics. And one of their recent myths that they've been putting out is this idea of green growth. It's this idea that we can decouple or de-link GDP growth from resource use. But peer-reviewed paper after peer-reviewed paper, and we're talking in the hundreds, has tried to model this possibility. And the overwhelming conclusion is we can't do this to any sort of magnitude that is sufficient in preventing us from breaching planetary boundaries, okay? Also, I'm not a communist, even though, I have French Kpuna too, and I know they're like early communists and all of this. Sorry, I'm not down with communism for many of reasons, but one of the reasons is also because they have not sufficiently dealt with the dependence on infinite economic growth. I think they tend to over rely on the idea of democratization fixes everything. It just ramifies into all things pono, and I think that's a very weak assumption, a very potentially dangerous assumption. And so I want students to know that when we're analyzing economic systems, we don't have to be anti-capitalist because we're anti-American. I hate America, but my question as to whether or not I like America is a separate question as to whether or not I like capitalism. And at the end of the day, it's just about being empirical. We don't need to be anti-capitalist because we want to be edgy or provocative or sexy. All we need to do is just be science-based, like our Kūpuna. So I wanted to mahalo some folks. Of course, kumu eo mai leni kukahiko, like she mentioned, she was my kumu in the Hawaiian Youth Abroad program. I learned a tremendous amount from her. One of the things I wanted to point out is the first ever lei that I made was in her papa. That'll always be a very special moment in my life. I tend to be overly cognitive, and so I just mahalo you for that step in becoming more embodied as a kanaka. Also, she's the one who did introduce me to Kulakaya Puni in a more nuanced way. It was definitely more of a black box for me, and I would imagine it's that way for many people in our lahui. So just thank you for being a tireless advocate and worker of our education system. We are all alive today because we descend from people who prioritize education. So thank you for continuing that tradition. I also want to mahalo Ili Malang and Kamala Inos. I think you might be on the call today, but I swear I didn't put your names here because I thought you'd be here. Your names are always here because both of you were very instrumental and influential on me in terms of beginning this research. Okay, so we're finally at the topic of the day. We are looking at an imaginary dialogue between our Kūpuna and Karl Marx. This is a comparative analysis between the capitalist and the Aloha ʻāina modes of production. We have two speakers here today. We have none other than the magnificent Queen Ka'ahumanu, who is going to be talking us through our ancestral economic theory. She is not selected for any particular reason that we have time to talk about today, but she's just one of my favorite ʻiwi, so that's why she's representing us today. We also have Karl Marx here. He's going to be talking through the capitalist sort of theory of political economy. If you're not familiar with Marx, he is a 19th century political economic thinker. He's arguably one of the most influential people who has ever lived. He's impacted the lives of billions and billions of people, whether or not they realize it. But that is not why he was invited to have this honor of talking with our queen today. Rather, he was invited because he is the author of Das Kapital. That is a German term that translates to capital. This is his magnum opus. It is arguably the most comprehensive analysis of capitalism that has ever been done. And so methods, I do want to touch on methods. That's something I would want young people to be aware of. I'm presenting this as a dialogue today because I feel that's exactly what I was trying to do in interpreting our ancestors' economic theory. More particularly, I was just trying to listen to them. It was very much a e homai ka ike, e homai ka maopopopono type of process. As much as I'm saying science this and evidence that, and I'm the closest thing to an atheist that a non-atheist can be. It did feel like a spiritual process. And I note this because what I want students to know is that our economic theory is in all of the existing sources that we know and love. So, our Olelo no Ea, our Mo'olelo, our Hula, our Oli, our written primary source documents, our archaeological evidence, anthropological evidence, geological evidence, the placial knowledge, the economic data is all encoded there by our Kūpuna if we're willing to listen. So we don't have to find, like the burial of Kamehameha Paea and we're going to find some manifesto in there or something like that. It's all available for us. The comparative method did allow me to better listen to our Kūpuna, and using capital in particular was helpful for a couple of reasons. The first thing is, although I'm anti-capitalist, I'm still biased towards capitalism. And I want us to all acknowledge that we are still biased towards capitalism as much as we may dislike it. But this book really, really interrogated me. It interrogated my biases. It allowed me to finally have like vocabulary and a conceptual framework to voice and articulate what I was feeling in my na'au. The second thing is that because it is a systematic analysis, it is a methodical approach, it is a helpful entry point through which we can understand our own system. So by having that as a reference point, this analysis of capitalism, it allowed me to translate over into understanding our Kūpuna, because right now we don't have any obvious, written literature on what our political economy is. But again, capital served as an anchor point. Okay, so this is the agenda for today. These are the sort of theories or sub-theories that we're going to be getting into. There's many, many more that need to be worked on. I want to add a lot more corroborating evidence for each and every point. I'm an accountant. We're all about our corroborating evidence. This is an unfinished work. I want to note that. And I want to, thank you for allowing me to share what is an early work. This is what I plan to take into a PhD. And then also, I just want to say that, again, we need many, many more people joining in this work, which is why that's a part of my kuleana. This is going to be, a kako type of effort for sure. Okay, sorry, I didn't name the items that we're looking at. So the basic unit of the economy, social relations, source of value, role of money in the economy. So starting with the basic unit of the economy and capitalism, and I'm going to be reading off the slides, so please bear with me. I'm trying to be like a narrator. And also note that the quotes are not directly ka'ahumanis. I know that will be obvious later, but just wanted to put that out there. Marx says the capitalist mode of production presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. What is a commodity? It is a product of human labor. So air, virgin soil, natural metals are not commodities. It is also produced to exchange with others in a market. So a product consumed by its producer is not a commodity. So let's break this down. Let's take why. Why would not be considered a commodity? Because it wasn't produced by human labor. Another criteria of a commodity, the product, even if it has human labor contained in it, it must be produced in order to exchange in a transaction. So for example, if you are privileged enough to have a backyard, you grow kalo in this backyard, you malama that kalo, you harvest that kalo, you and your ohana harvest it and make that poi, and you and your ohana eat it, that's not a commodity. But if instead you take that same exact poi and then you take it to the farmer's market, it has suddenly become a commodity. Okay, what is the basic unit of the economy in an Aloha ʻāina context? Well, it's actually relationships. So Ka'ahumanu says we do not have commodities or markets. Kanaka produce most of what they themselves consume. What we did not produce with our own hands was made by the hands of our relatives along our ahupua'a, all of whom we know by name. So the takeaway here is that we had a self-sufficient economy, but I don't want to say that in the cliche way that we understand it. We know that we had a self-sufficient economy. We were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? What Kahumanu is getting at here is that we were self-sufficient at the ohana level, at the level of relationships in the society. We had a very distributed level of production. This is the way we mediated production. And this is very important for many of reasons. Essentially, Ka'ahumanu is saying that we Kanaka produced ourselves the things that we needed. And if we didn't produce it with our own hands, then it was people that we knew by name that produced these products. So in a future post-occupied Hawaiian Kingdom political economy, we need to hold ourselves to that standard again of becoming producers. So a part of my PhD program will be looking into technologies that will allow us to, begin to localize and become manufacturers here in Hawaii on a distributed basis. So there's technologies such as 3D printing and fully recyclable plastics. These things can allow us to create very sophisticated products at this sort of ohana, smaller scale sort of level. Okay. So social relations of the economy is our next topic. What does Marx have to say? He's like, well, that's very interesting, Queen Ka'ahumanu, that a relationship is the basic unit of your economy, because in capitalism, relationships between commodities and not people mediate production. He says commodities befriend one another in market transactions. The relations connecting the labor of one individual with that of the rest appear as material relations between persons and social relationships between things. The producers do not come into social contact with each other until they exchange their products. Marx call this commodity fetishization. So to me, this is the most important original contribution coming from Karl Marx in Das Kapital. Marx actually cites a lot of other thinkers in his work. So he did a doctorate in Greek philosophy. So there's a lot of Aristotle coming through. There's a lot of classical economic thought coming through. He's citing Adam Smith and David Ricardo. That's one of the things that makes Capital so great, is that it's just like this genealogy of thought. But anyway, this is a very important original contribution, the commodity fetishization. And essentially, Marx has identified that in capitalism, it's the commodities that are in relationship with each other. We as laborers are alienated from relating. And this is very dangerous. This is what allows there to be so much exploit in capitalism, because relationships are the birthplace of accountability. So it's a very scary thing. Marx is saying the labor don't even come into contact until they're exchanging. I would say as capitalism has progressed into the 21st century, we don't even have that. Okay, social relations of an Aloha ʻāina economy. Ka'ahumanu says pilina between relatives mediate production. We do not relate to each other through transactions or market exchanges, but through interpersonal interactions or interpersonal exchanges. She goes on to say our face-to-face intimacy requires a place-based localized economy. Capitalist production sprawls across the globe with no respect for planetary or social limits. Your iPhone requires components from 43 countries across 6 continents. It is impossible for all those laborers spanning scores of languages, geopolitics, and worldviews to share pilina with one another. Our goddess Pele warned us of the distance created by capitalism when she said, "A'oheo kahinana oluno kapali, iho mai lalo nei, ike ke ao nui ke ao iki he alo a he alo." Roughly translates to English as the top of the cliff isn't the place to look at us. Come down here and learn of the big and little currents face to face. So we know this olelo no eao, we know this is something we abide by in our way of relating, but I want us to also see that Pele is an economist here. She's talking about the big and little currents. And what is a current? Current is energy, current is power. What is power? Power is labor. So she's saying our labor relations as well need to be face to face and intimacy. And in practical terms, that means we need to have a hyper place based localized economy. And what I wanted to weave back in here is this idea of a science based economy. And what a science based economy ultimately does is it adheres to laws of nature. So it conforms to biological limits of physics and chemistry, right? And so in this context, we're talking about the spatial and the temporal capacities of a human. There's only so much we can stretch ourselves in maintaining these sort of deep pilina. And so I want you to think about your cell phone. I want you to think about the thousands of hands that went into making the cell phone. Do you feel you can maintain that level of relationship with all those laborers? And not only them, do you feel you can have deep pilina with all the aina that went into this phone? And so in our future preferred economy, if the answer is no, then we need to figure out a different way to produce this. And if we can't produce the product in such a way that honors relationships as the basic unit of the economy, we need to ask whether or not we really need this product because the cost may just be too high. Okay, now we're moving on to source of value in the economy, and we have an intruder here. This is Alan Greenspan. He's a former Fed chair of the United States. He is going to be representing Econ 101 mythology today. Again, I wanted to bring this in here because this is the hegemonic economic thought, neoclassical economics weaved in with some Keynesian economics. They want nothing more than for you to believe that market economies are laws of nature, right? So just like colonizers and every other discipline, they try to distort the truth, they try to obscure the truth. They want to control definitions of knowledge. Economists want you to think they're most objective and most rational of all disciplines. And what I've noticed they do in particular is they sort of layer these distortions over the truth, layer it, and then they package these distortions and present it to you as if it's the truth itself. And so we need to increase our analysis to be able to use science to debunk essentially the mythology that they're inundating us with. And so one of the major stories that they tell usually on day one of Intro to Econ is this idea of supply and demand. And so Alan Greenspan says the market value of a product is determined by its price, and price is determined by supply and demand. So the first thing they want is for you to confuse price and value. They want you to believe those are one and the same when they're not. Also, they say price and therefore value is driven by supply and demand. So again, day one of Intro to Econ, you're presented this graph. On the y-axis is the quantity, on the x-axis is the price. You have y equals mx plus b lines representing supply and demand curves. The point at which these lines intersect is your equilibrium. And they tell you this is what is driving price and therefore value in the economy. What I would want Hamana to know is this idea has never been scientifically proven. It cannot be scientifically proven. And that is because we cannot control the independent variable. We cannot manipulate that variable. So while we can conclude that there is a correlative relationship here, there is no causal relationship that we can prove with science. And so therefore, there is another confounding variable that is going to explain what is the true source of value in the economy. And Marx lets us know right now when he says, the market value of a product is determined by the quantity of human labor contained in it. Each producer's labor does not show itself except in the act of exchange, which is why it gets really confusing. The equivalency principle requires that commodities being exchanged in the market have an equal amount of socially necessary human labor embedded in them. As a hypothetical example, 10 pairs of AirPods and one iPhone are equivalent in the market because they both contain 10 hours of human labor. So very, very important concept coming from Capital. This is not even Marx's original idea. This is a labor theory of value coming from David Ricardo, a classical economists, but why do the neoclassical economists not tell us about this? Why do they hide the truth? It's because, as we learned earlier, when you have an analysis of labor, you have an analysis of power, and then you're better equipped to overcome the systems that are set up to destroy us. Another thing that Marx points out is that the market, in theory, sort of regulates and ensures that equal amounts of human labor are being exchanged in different products and services. So just pretend that you're trying to trade this phone that you created, and then this person, you know, they come with their American flag toilet paper, they want to trade with you, and you're like, no, we don't have a deal because this took me 10 hours to make, and I know making your American flag toilet paper only took you 30 minutes. Sorry. Okay, source of value in Aloha ʻāina economy, Ka'ahumanu says the value of a product is determined by the quantity of human and non-human labor contained in it. We account for our ʻāina's labor that goes into the kalo, kapa, and other items we use for daily living. Capitalists have forgotten the labor value of the ecosystem as they are completely severed from their non-human relatives. We too apply the equivalency principle as we exchange, but again, we do not exchange through markets. Because we're in deep relationship with people and ecosystems that provide for our needs, we ensure each ohana member contributes their fair share of labor through non-market mechanisms. This allows us to circulate things by sharing. So of course, this is where we diverge from capitalism in an incredible way. We actually value the labor of our ʻāina. In neoclassical economics, they call these things like externalities or the commons, or they have these all, you know, these side categories of terms just to create a bunch of confusion when they should just be properly accounting for the labor in the first place, the way that our Kūpuna did. Also, we upheld the idea of the equivalency principle, so ensuring that equal amounts of labor were flowing through the economy and being contributed by each one of its participants. But again, this was not a tit for tat sort of process. So to draw the contrast, I want you to imagine that you have a pound of poi, and then you put it up for a trade on Exchange Ave, which is a sort of barter app here on Oahu created by a kanaka, John Aloha. I think he's on the call today. Please look into that app when you have time. But you put your poi up on Exchange Ave, and then this stranger, they want to trade with you. They want to provide you one uala. And you're like, I'm not sure about that. I know this took me 10 hours to make, and that uala I know it takes about 7 hours to make. Sorry, we don't have a deal. Now I want you to imagine that this person is your cousin and you're not on Exchange Ave. You're showing up to dinner tonight. You're not going to be like, yeah, cousin, you can have, you know, 7/10 of my poi, right? It's not going to be regulated in that sort of way. It's just day in and day out, each one of us are contributing. But if your hoahana, your cousin, 1 month later is still slacking, they are not providing their fair share, you are going to address this, but you're going to address this in a way that holds the relationship as the basic unit of the economy. So you're going to say, hey, cuz, how are you? Surfing was really fun earlier. I was just wondering if I could share with you some stress I'm going through. I'm feeling really overwhelmed with all the tasks of our ohana. I was just wondering if you could help and pick up this particular kuleana. It'd make me feel really supported. So, right, when we're dealing with relationships, that's how these things are worked out. And, you know, also if your cousin was sick, right, and that's why they couldn't provide as much, you're going to know that because you are in deep relationship with this person. Therefore, you're going to be willing to pick up the workload in this scenario. Okay, now we're going to look lastly at the role of money in the economy. We have Econ 101 mythology in the mix again. Alan Greenspan says, money's primary function is to lubricate exchange by replacing the difficult process of direct barter. I, the neoclassical economist, completely ignore evidence that barter never existed and blindly worship Adam Smith as my God. I, the neoclassical economist, also ignore behavioral economics evidence that consistently demonstrates the conflation of price and value by consumers. So if you're hearing about the myth and storytelling of supply and demand on day one, you're hearing about the myth of how money was invented and barter on day 2 of Intro to Econ class. And so this cartoon is depicting the sort of storytelling that they do left and right. There's this person who has a cow. Looks like they want some pottery for their cow, but the person with the pottery doesn't look like they want a cow. So we have a mismatch of needs in this bartering scenario. And so the neoclassical economists say, poof, money was invented to make everyone's lives easier. It's fungible, it's portable, it's going to allow us to lubricate the flow of goods and services. Okay, there's so many errors in that story, but one of them is that anthropologists have an overwhelming consensus that barter never existed. So why do the economists keep telling us about the origins of money based on a phenomenon that never was? And the conclusion is that they are trying to hide the more insidious nature of money. And so we're able to begin uncovering some of the dangers of money. And one of them is that it causes us again to confuse price for value. And through fields such as behavioral finance, which is something I want to keep going into in my PhD, it's the intersection of psychology and finance. Study after study in peer-reviewed journals show that this is a widespread issue. So for example, consumers are more likely to purchase a product if it ends with 99 cents. So you are induced into buying something at a disproportionate level if it's $4.99 compared to if it was just $5. Okay. Marx is also about to illuminate the insidious, dangerous nature of money when he says money measures social power and enables individuals to hoard social power as private property. From being the mere means of affecting circulation of commodities, money becomes the end and the aim. Price ceases altogether to express value. Objects that are not commodities, such as conscience, honor, etc., are capable of being offered for sale. Along with the extension of circulation increases the power of money, that absolutely social form of wealth ever ready for use. He quotes Christopher Columbus, who says, "Gold is a wonderful thing. Whoever possesses it is lord of all he wants. By means of gold, one can even get souls into paradise." So students need to recognize that money is not this neutral, benign byproduct of capitalism or other market forms of economies. No, it's actually the end goal. It's the entire purpose of capitalism. And why? Because money is what Marx calls the universal equivalent. And by being the universal equivalent, you can acquire all other commodities. Through money, you can acquire the means of production to produce all other commodities. And again, what is a commodity? It is a product or service that contains labor. And what is labor? Labor is power. So money is dangerous in its nature because it allows private individuals to hoard social power, what's supposed to be a collective power, as private property. Marx says that ultimately price ceases altogether to express value. You can purchase things that are not even meant to be commodities, such as conscience and honor. And I would extend that to sex. You know, white men are able to purchase the bodies of women of color because they have this power that is money. We should have sex with people because we want to, not because we need money to survive. But that is the nature of money. It turns things into commodities. It turns our bodies into commodities. Okay, so this will be the last slide of the day. This is probably my favorite part of the discussion. Queen Ka'ahumanu says, money has, oh my gosh, I'm blocking a part of what I need to read. Hold on. Money has no role in our economy. Our currency is mana, which also measures social power, but does not allow individuals to accumulate it at the expense of others. She quotes Kamuela Enos, who says, given the cashless nature of traditional society, the accumulation of mana can be considered an economic concern. Perceived wealth was determined by the abundance of the land and the capacity of the society to maintain a functioning biosystem in situ, end quote. Ka'ahumanu goes on to say, while the capitalist accumulates money by producing more and more commodities, which exploits the earth and its life forms, mana is only earned by conforming to biological limits. This is exemplified in the makahiki, which requires maka'ainana to pause from labor for a season. Only ali'i who cared for the people in place will be able to meet this rest requirement. So we have a lot going on here, so let's break it down. Let's start with the makahiki. Let's talk about it in the way that we most commonly do. And so we understand that makahiki is one of the most significant religious events happening in our Aina. It is the primary conduit through which our ali'i and our communities accrue mana. How do they accrue this mana? Well, a couple of things. They provide ho'okupu to our god Lono, right? And we know our maka'ainana are putting in their best skills and their best efforts into creating these products that get offered to our god. Another thing is we know that our people participate in so-called games and contests, right? And same thing, this is a demonstration of strength, physically, intellectually, emotionally, mentally, and otherwise. And through this ceremony, right, through this offering to our God, we are then able to begin to acquire mana through this process. We also know that during makahiki, it's a period of feasting, resting, and play. I can't think of anything that is in starker contrast to capitalism than makahiki. Okay, so yes, it is a very important religious activity, but what we also need to understand, what the students need to understand is this is the most significant economic event happening in our Aina as well. It is the culmination of our economic science and philosophy. And I have to mahalo Kamu, who really illuminated this for me through just like these few passages. I did ask him to write a book, but he's super busy doing a lot of important things. So this is my humble effort in trying to begin writing that so-called book. But he says, again, mana can be considered an economic concern. So with that in mind, I want us to think about what do we actually need to do to be successful in makahiki? And so through some a priori theorizing, I think we need to look at what's happening during the non-makahiki season. So in the season of Ku, I want us to do a scenario analysis. I want you to pretend you're an ali'i. And this year you're feeling indulgent as an ali'i. You want extra ahu'ula and you want it now. You want extra lokui'a and you want it now. And because we are understanding this from an economic vantage point, we know that every decision has an opportunity cost. Every decision has a trade-off. This is a cost-benefit analysis. So what do we gain by having our maka'ainana focus their labor and therefore their power on our frivolous ali'i projects? We gain that, but what do we lose? And what we lose is diverting the labor of our people away from preparing a surplus. And a surplus is absolutely needed in order to show up to makahiki successfully. If you're going to be feasting, resting, playing, and providing ho'okupu to our akua, yeah, you need to be creating a surplus during the season of Ku. Also, another thing you're diverting their labor and therefore their power away from is their ability to prepare for the so-called contests and games. And Kamu has showed me that this is not just fun and games. This is actually a performance review that is happening. So at the end of the day, the makahiki is an assessment of our labor capacity as a society. So we are rewarded mana because of this demonstration. Mana is absolutely connected to labor. And so going back to our scenario, you've been this greedy ali'i all year. Now you and your people are showing up to makahiki. Chances are people are going to be tired. They might be hungry. They're not going to be doing well in the performance review. Their ho'okupu, the products they're providing, is probably going to be substandard. So guess what? You're not getting very much mana as an ali'i and as a community that year. And that has to probably be the worst possible outcome for an ali'i. And so I want us to behold this fantastic system of economic incentives that our Kūpuna created here. I think we should, recognize Lono as a god of economics for sure. And I want us to understand what is the incentive trying to motivate us to do. Incentives are studied heavily in econ and finance. We look at what is called agency problems. We're constantly trying to prevent conflicts of interest and this sort of thing. So what is the motivation? What is the incentive propelling our people to do? Well, it's trying to incentivize them to adhere to laws of nature. So again, going back to Kamu's quote, he says, perceived wealth was determined by what? Was it extra ahu'ula and lokui'a in any one given year? No. It was the ability to maintain a functioning biosystem in situ, a functioning biosystem in place in conformity with laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. That is what it ultimately comes down to with our economic theory, going back to that point on being science driven. And I want to highlight that our Kūpuna had this empirical system, not because they're smarter than other people, they're not more woke than other people. No, it's because when you do live on the planet's most isolated landmass, you have no plan Bs. So if you decide to get greedy, the consequences of that decision are going to be felt acutely and rapidly. Systems are going to fail with vengeance, you know, and it was Kamu and Kumu at UH West Oahu that always highlighted and drove this point, and I thank them for that, not over glamorizing the context through which our ancestors ultimately thrive. They had to get those hard knocks, those hard lessons, and ultimately it came down to being science-based or you die. It's science-based or you die, and that's it. And I thank them for always highlighting that reality. Also, you know, when Kamu talks about abundance, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation of that, he's not talking about inherent abundance of our ʻāina. You know, he's not saying like the ʻāina just creates limitless lako. There's just things growing left and right and it's easy living. The abundance I hear him talking about is created through this deliberateness to conform to our biosphere. You know, it's because of that effort by our Kpuna, that's the condition through which abundance is created. I want to say that West Side folks, like we tend to focus on the downside more than others because we are, you know, a part of the suffering more commonly than other parts of the island. So I think that's why, you know, we have this sort of risk-based approach in our analysis. And then also in a historical context, you know, that wasn't the inherently abundant part of the ʻāina or the mokupuni rather. It was not a inherently vai part of the island. It's a drier part of the island. But yet we see that our Kūpuna in that area still created conditions for which all the people, the community could thrive. And so I want to harken back to the marginalized people of our community, the people that all of you are in the trenches with, as my cousin would say, day in and day out. If our Kūpuna could create a society of thriving for all under adverse conditions of being in an island context, then we need to hold ourselves to that same standard. We need to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. And of course, we're going to be doing that by having a science-driven economy in the way of our Kūpuna. So mahalo for listening. I don't know where we're at in time. I'm not sure if we can do questions, but I can stay behind or you can contact me if you want to chat more. But thank you so much.
Mahalo, Christina. I'm going to actually stop the recording and so people can feel like they can ask whatever the questions